Opening your textbooks to page 22. And we want to discuss some of the terms that you're going to come across in your reading in this chapter 1, the section Mesopotamia, the restoration of civilization. So how do we know the terms that we need to know? Well, the boldface terms, right, give us a good clue. So let's look down through here. On page 22, we have under the Sumerian civilization, which is what we're going to look at first, the term polytheistic. What does polytheistic mean? Right?
Many gods.
Many gods. So if people are polytheistic, they worship many gods. The next column, we see the word cuneiform. Does anybody know what cuneiform is? It's sometimes called wedge writing. If you look back to some of the pictures we had before the beginning of the book, let's see, on page 4, see the picture there with the big hand, and there's little marks on there. That's called cuneiform. Cuneiform writing. So I won't explain more about it later, but it has it's something made in clay, and you use a wedge-shaped instrument to make marks in it, and that is a way of communication. In the next page, not much there, but in the second column we have there are 3 boldface words there. At the top of the second column we have the word ziggurat. How many of you have ever heard of a ziggurat before? Okay, a couple people. It's simply a temple tower. So these were imitations of the original Tower of Babel. Call them ziggurats. Under Sargon, we have the ruler Sargon, that's his name, so we'll know that. And he established the first known empire. And it defines for us there, the word empire, the rule of one people over another. All right, then we turn the page. And under Amorite civilization, that's following the Sumerians, we have the king Hammurabi. How many of you have ever heard of Hammurabi? Okay, quite a few of you, that's good. And you can see there he was a king of the Amorites, and we'll find out about him and his laws. That's the important thing for him. Over on page 25, second column, we find a work of literature called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And we'll look at that more in detail when we get to that as well. Down at the bottom of page 25, we have another important term, astronomy. And if you look on the next page, page 26, we have the word astrology. Who thinks they can tell me the difference between astronomy and astrology? Or what do they have in common? Let's start with what they have in common. What does astronomy and astrology have in common? What do they both do? Jordan?
They both involve the stars.
Yeah, they both study the stars, right? Okay, so what's the difference? Anybody know the difference between astronomy and astrology? What do you think, Jordan?
Astronomy is like studying the stars, and astrology is like trying to interpret.
Okay, that's pretty good. Any other ideas? I'll give you a key word for both of them. Jordan's right. Astronomy is studying the stars just to understand more about them, and the planets. We include that as well. So that is science. Astrology is interpreting the stars as having some influence upon the lives of people, thinking that the stars somehow determine what happens to you. And that's superstition. Okay, both start with S. So remember that. Astronomy is science. Astrology is superstition. You got it? Any questions? So it's horoscopes, things like that would be astrology. All right. If you got that, then let's see. Are there any more? I think that's the last of the boldface words that we have. All right, now in your outline, we want to cover some material that some of which is in your book and some which is not, much of which is not. So open your outline and let's follow along. All right, so we're looking at ancient history, and you might wonder why it says church history. Well, the reason we're calling it church history is because God has always had his people. God has always had a people that belong to him. And so we can go back into history as far as we want. We'll always find a group of people that belong to God, that God has called to himself. And so, in a sense, we have church history all throughout history. From creation to the cross, it's a time of anticipation, looking forward to the time when Christ would come and die on the cross. After that, we have a time of anticipation for the fulfillment of all things, Christ's return, or the consummation of the ages, as Ken Ham calls it. So it's a time of anticipation, looking forward, but also reflection, looking back at the cross. So history can be divided into creation to the cross and from the cross on, as you know from the 7 C's that you're learning. And throughout that time, we have a theme of redemption. At the fall, of course, we have the initial preparation for redemption, as God promised that someday the woman would have a seed that would destroy the seed of the serpent. We have the purchase of that redemption taking place at the cross, as Jesus Christ is the incarnation. He is God incarnate, God become flesh, and so he comes and purchases our redemption at the cross. And he is raised from the dead to demonstrate that God accepted that purchase, that sacrifice. And then when we come to the end of the world, we have the accomplishment of redemption, when all things are made new. So redemption, God's glory revealed, and redemption accomplished as we look through history. We start our mission here at the first civilization that occurred following the flood in the area of Ur. Does the name Ur sound familiar to any of you? Some of you. There are 2 major rivers in this area called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is the area between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. So as you look at where these rivers go, this area here came to be called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is actually a Greek word, so this word wasn't used at the time of these ancient civilizations, but was a name given by the Greeks. And it simply means between, meso, in the middle of, or between, Potamia is rivers, between the rivers. You know this part of the word from the animal that lives in a river called hippopotamus, right? The hippopotamus means river horse. Potama means river. So the hippopotamus, Mesopotamia, hopefully you can remember it that way, between the rivers, between the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates. So we begin our journey here in the city of Ur, and this area is called Sumer. In your notes you see it there as Sumer. In the Bible, when we come across this area, we find this called Shinar. So anytime you see in Genesis in particular, Shinar, that's talking about the same civilization that we're going to be looking at here. Now, there are several contributions that the Sumerians made to civilization. And it's interesting as we look at this very first civilization that people have found, that archaeologists, historians have found, and we know it's the first civilization after the flood, but what we don't know is how advanced civilization was before the flood. This is the first one after. It's interesting to me that this first civilization came up with so much for the first time, according to historians. I don't think it was the first time. I think they had information that was passed on through Noah and his sons from before the flood. But the first innovation that they are credited with is cuneiform writing. And here is a sample of cuneiform writing. You can see that it is made with little marks there, and it's made with something called a stylus. A stylus is a little piece of wood, I suppose, or it could be bone, with something on the end of it to make these marks, and by making those marks, they are communicating. Initially, the cuneiform was intended to keep track of numbers. So you have on the, as we'll see, in that area, there's a lot of trade going on, and they had to have a way to keep track of how many bags of flour were brought on board this boat and who bought it and things like that. But eventually, they figured out a way to use this system not only to communicate numbers, but ideas, and I'm not sure I understand how. Now, I tried my own hand at cuneiform writing over in the art room one day. Asked Mrs. Mahoney for some clay, and I found an instrument that would allow me to make something very similar to that, just so you could see how it's done. All right, so we'll pass this around, and I'm not going to try to pretend this is from ancient Sumer. This is from not so ancient Hartland Christian School. But I made an attempt to put these in such a way that you can see maybe more closely than what you can tell right there. And I think it's pretty close. So you can pass that around and take a look at it while we're talking. All right, so any questions about the cuneiform writing? It was done in clay, and then what happens when the clay hardens? It becomes permanent. And in fact, after a very long time, it starts breaking apart. That piece that you're passing around used to be bigger. Parts have been broken off over the years. All right, any questions? So you need to remember that cuneiform and stylus is what was written with on clay tablets. Another neat thing they did with writing was to create a cylinder seal. Now, a seal would be an indication that this is an official document of some kind. So notice what they did. They made this round object and carved into it figures so that when they rolled it on the clay, it would come out like that. Did you understand the process? Maybe some of you have done something like that before. You know, you have a cylinder and you can roll it on it, and it leaves an impression. So that is the seal. Any questions about that? The Sumerians are also credited with inventing the wheel and wheeled carts. You know, a wheel by itself doesn't do much good. You attach it to a cart, and it does a lot of good. It enables you to transport things. And you think about the items that were coming into Sumer from along the river in the trade, they needed to have carts to haul it away from the river to wherever it was going. They also became masters of irrigation. They learned how to build canals and water-raising devices to get water from one level to another. They built dikes. Everybody know what a dike is? It's a kind of a dam. And that was to control flooding. They learned how to drain marshlands or swamps so they could use it for farming. So they did a lot of the area that had to do with preparing land for farming, using the land however they wished. Everybody get a chance to see my wonderful artwork. That's the best artwork I ever did. All the time I had art class in school, I never produced anything quite so nice. That gives you an idea of my artistic ability. So those of you who are no good at art, you can have this aspiration. Someday you can maybe use it in your form. The Sumerians also came up with a land measurement that we in part still use today. They called the land area an iku, I-Q-U, iku. that has become our word, acre. That's where we get it. All the way back to the very first civilization. They passed it on up to us. They came up with the idea of city-states. That is, of cities organizing governments. And something that we saw in the text, the ziggurat. They built ziggurats as tower temples. You can see the ramps. See, these are people. So you can see how huge this is by the size of the people that are walking up the ramp. That's a model, or drawing, I should say, and that's a picture of a model of a ziggurat. They also came up with a method of dividing time based on the number 60. Have you ever wondered why there are 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour? You ever wondered that? You just accepted it, never thought about it at all. Isn't that interesting, though? I don't know why. I'm sure there's a scientific reason why, but they came up with it back there in Sumer. Because they're on the rivers, they also developed large boats for carrying cargo, and they later added sails. This is an actual boat that was discovered in that part of the world, one that had been buried, and they found it. So very interesting how large of boats they were able to construct for sailing on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. All right, any questions about the contributions that the Sumerians made to civilization? Again, isn't it interesting that we don't have a civilization that just contributed the wheel, and then another civilization contributed writing, and another one contributed building boats? All of these innovations came from the very first civilization. That doesn't make sense unless there were people before that already had developed those things. You see what I mean? And so it seems to me that the knowledge of how to build these things came from the civilizations that were here before the flood. We don't often think about that because we don't have much information, but it stands to reason that people knew how to do those things prior to the flood. Civilization had advanced. There were millions of people, maybe even billions of people on the earth prior to the flood, and they've been here for thousands, a couple thousand years, and so it's not unlikely that they would have developed these things. All right, any questions about the contributions? All right, next let's look at the society of the Sumerians. We find that they had 4 different levels of society. On top of society were the nobles. I'm sure you're familiar with that word. The nobles consisted of the important priests and relatives of the king. The nobles, of course, would have been the ones that owned most of the land. Okay, got that for the nobles. Next we have the commoners. The commoners would have included merchants, scribes. What's a scribe? What is that term? What's a scribe? Joel?
Someone who would write back then.
Yeah, so, and a scribe would have been someone who would have written with cuneiform, using a stylus. Okay, that's good. Let's get these terms in our heads. So he would be considered a commoner, along with farmers and skilled workers. Essentially, the commoners would be like our middle class. They would be the skilled workers of the Sumerian society. Thirdly, we have what are called clients. These are servants. These are people that work for nobles or for the temple. These are servants. Now, what I find interesting is how they were paid. Now, when we think of someone today working, they get paid in money. But they didn't have money yet. They paid them in food, which is understandable, and wool. So if they're paid in wool, does that tell you anything else about their culture? What do they have? Sheep land.
They have sheep and they know how to get it off the sheep.
Yeah, they have sheep, they know how to shear them, right? And they must use wool. That was one of the things the servants were paid with. All right, and then bottom on the list, like any society, are slaves. We find in the very first civilization that there are slaves. Now, most of these slaves were prisoners of war. Whenever the Sumerians had a war with anybody else around, whoever they captured, they made a slave. Some of them were slaves out of punishment. They didn't have jails back then. Throughout most of history, there have not been prisons like we have today. If someone had committed a terrible crime, they might be made a slave. And we find even at this early time that there are oftentimes debtors, the people who are largely in debt, they owe a lot of money, and they could turn their family into slaves in order to pay off the debt. So slaves mostly were prisoners of war, some were there out of punishment, and some were debtors who sold themselves or their family into slavery to pay their debts. And that's generally true throughout all of history until we get to the more modern slavery we had in this country in the 19th century. And then it's really different. All right, any questions about the social classes? For the Sumerians, family was important. Parents maintained strict control. We find interesting in this very first civilization, women could own property or start businesses. Sometimes they held important religious positions, even serving as chief priestess. So apparently it's later cultures that tend to start putting women down. All right, what were some of the main occupations? Well, you could already guess at some of them. Farming was certainly a major occupation. The crops that they grew included wheat, barley, vegetables, dates, and figs. Pretty normal. Some people were shepherds or herdsmen. And of course, we know that they herded sheep. They also had goats, and they had donkeys, and there were some oxen. Now, have any of you know enough about the animals and what they do to figure out what the oxen would be used for? Anybody have an idea what oxen were used for?
Pulling maybe a plow or a heavy wagon.
Yeah, plowing mostly. Yeah. So oxen were used for plowing. And what about donkeys? What would you use a donkey for? Giving rides to the children. No. Remember they invented the wheel? Right?
Pull a little cart.
Yeah, pulling carts or wagons. Yeah, that's what donkeys were good for. Some of the people were skilled workers, as we've already mentioned. So you're a farmer, shepherd, or a skilled worker. Some of the skilled workers learned how to make cloth from the wool, as you might have expected. You were considered a skilled worker if you were involved in astronomy, studying the stars. There were people that learned the law. There were lawyers. There were those that learned medicine. They even had sculptors, which indicates that their society was advanced enough that people had leisure time, that people could dedicate themselves to art. They had potters. In fact, the finest pottery in the history of Mesopotamia was at this period. You would think that this would be the worst and they'd get better as they went along. This was the best at the beginning. Again, indicating there had to be a knowledge of the previous civilizations before the flood on how to do these things. They also had metalsmiths who made armor, spears, swords, and chariots. That's something else the donkeys pulled, were chariots. Now, I'm sure something you're all interested in finding out about is, what about their education? Surely it was not as bad as we had it, right? Sitting in our air-conditioned classroom. Well, the education was limited to the wealthy boys. and it was done by the priests. So you can see the boys here sitting on their nice, comfortable stone benches with no backs. Does that look good? The priest is there teaching them. Notice they've each got a little clay tablet. They've got a little stylus. And if they use this clay each day, just add some water to it, keep from hardening, and then they could kind of press out whatever was there, and they could reuse it. It's sort of like reusing paper, erasing it, and starting over again. There was strict discipline in the school. If you misbehaved, you didn't get a detention. You didn't get sent to stand in the corner. You got beat with a cane. In fact, that's what this guy's back here for. He's watching. This guy's educating. This guy's watching to see if anybody's out of line. And I guarantee you, he's got a cane down here where you can't see. But of course, I'm sure they didn't go to school all day, right? They started at sunrise, and they went home at sunset. No athletics, no after school programs because it was dark. So all day long they're in school. So it doesn't make what you have to do look so bad, does it? Next, let's talk about religion. The religion of the Sumerians. Well, they worshipped a god called Anu, or sometimes it's just An, who was the chief deity and head of the Sumerian pantheon of gods. Then there is Inanna. Isn't she pretty?
Yep.
She is the goddess of love.
Interesting.
What? Oh, yeah, she's the sister of the queen of Hades, you said? And Hades would be a Greek word, so whatever the Sumerian equivalent of that is. She was believed to bring fertility and prosperity to Sumer through her marriage to the god Dumuzi. What I found interesting as I started looking at these gods in Sumer is that there was a god of destruction in the Sumerian civilization, and his name was Allah.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Allah goes back a long ways. He was a god of destruction. Well, the mythology of the Mesopotamians was a series of repeated stories that explained the unexplainable. That's how most mythology comes about. You know, you probably, when you were a kid, maybe read or heard stories about, you know, how the woodpecker got its red head, or how the chickadee got its song, or, you know, stories about how those things came about. And so mythology is largely those kind of stories and becomes the backbone of their religion. The religion of Mesopotamia, of course, is the oldest religion of which we have records. The Mesopotamians believed that the world was a flat disk. See here, flat disk, surrounded by a vast hollow space, and that this was enclosed in an overarching heaven. So here's the heavens above, and here's the netherworld, or what Victoria mentioned as being called Hades by the Greeks, down below. And then there's this sea all around them. The sea was all around the earth, top, middle, and sides. So there's water all around encompassing the earth, which is a flat disk in the middle. And they said the universe had come out of these waters. Of course, the Mesopotamians were polytheistic, as we know already. The Sumerians were clearly in touch with the spirit world. In matters of physical health, they relied on spiritual remedies and turned to exorcists, those who could cast out spirits, to get rid of the demons that were possessing them. One of these demons was Pazuzu. Even though he was king of the evil demons, his image was used to protect women in childbirth. You can't imagine if you're a woman giving birth to a child, you would want this image looking at you, but that's what they did. And in fact, this is one of the motifs in the film The Exorcist. The Mesopotamian pantheon included a lot of members. Here's the whole thing, and there's no way we could go through all of it, but just to show you how complicated it all is, and maybe you can pick out some of the names that I'll give you some of the primary members of the Sumerian pantheon. The Sumerian word for universe is Anki. This denotes the god An and the goddess Ki. An was the chief deity and head of the Sumerian pantheon of gods. Their offspring was Enlil, the air god. You see Enlil, there's Enki, there's Anu. Let's see Enlil on there. Might have a different name on this chart. Enlil was the air god. He's considered the most powerful god in the Sumerian pantheon. Enlil and his powers parallels the Greek god Zeus and the Roman god Jupiter. Now, there is one of the stories is about Nimrod, who I don't see on here. There's Dumuzi or other Tammuz. I think Ninsun is possibly the same thing. Nimrod, of course, is a biblical name, and we find that name in Genesis as a person. And according to the legend, when Nimrod died, his wife Semiramis concocted a story designed to keep herself in power. So I think that would possibly be these two. She related that Nimrod had traveled to the sun to become the sun god, and then impregnated her via a sunbeam, making it a virgin birth of sorts. Although Semiramis was a seriously immoral person, so she wasn't exactly a virgin. But it was a non-physical conception, I suppose. The child born, whose name was Tammuz, right here, was supposedly the reincarnation of Nimrod. So he's the son of the sun god. As a result, Tammuz was considered to be a god incarnate and became the object of great worship. Later, Tammuz was killed by a wild boar, and Semiramis wept for her son for 40 days. Then he is resurrected. This takes place in the early spring. Semiramis is perpetuated by some different names throughout history. In the Bible, we find this goddess called Ashtaroth. We find her called the Queen of Babylon, Venus, Aphrodite, Diana, Isis Gaia, Mother Nature, and Queen of Heaven. So these are some of the names that come from worshiping the same goddess, Semiramis. So there is a story that sounds similar to the true story of Jesus being born, of God and a woman, although not impregnated with a sunbeam, but the Holy Spirit, and that Jesus died and was resurrected from the dead. Now there's some who say that these resurrection stories that seem to occur in ancient times aren't found until after Christianity. So it may be that some went back into these mythological records and changed some things. Not sure. There are hundreds of other gods and goddesses that were born from these Sumerian gods. There is, I've already mentioned Anu, Enlil, the Lord Storm, Utu, the sun god, Nir, Hursag, Mother Earth, the lady who gives birth, Enki, the Lord of Wisdom, or Lord Earth. He's the god of the underground fresh waters. Inanna, goddess of love and war. The patron deity of Uruk. She's mistress of the date clusters, mistress of heaven, goddess of fertility and love, protector of harlots. She was believed to bring fertility and prosperity to Sumer through her marriage to the god Dumuzi. She's also the goddess of the planet Venus as morning and evening star. And as I said, her name means Queen of Heaven. Dumuzi is a shepherd god, and Inanna's husband. He is mentioned in Ezekiel 8:14. Then there's Ninurta, who is the god of the plow. Ereshkigal, queen of the greater earth, the underworld. Marduk or Merodach, the young bull of the thunderstorms, or the city god of Babylon eventually, and he's mentioned in the Bible. Another interesting feature of the Mesopotamian mythological world were the winged bulls. We'll come back to the religion next time. For tomorrow, I want you to read about this civilization in the article called Gilgamesh, Genesis, and so on. It's an article in your packet of materials. Read and highlight Gilgamesh, Genesis, etc. You're dismissed.